Well, I want to appreciate everyone coming today. This is our first Tuesday in January. Hope you had a great new year. Appreciate you coming today. We've got a great lineup for 2015, and I'm looking forward to them. And so I appreciate everyone coming. It's good to see you. January 8th will be the 200th anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans. And so it was the last time the British would campaign in the United States. And so today I wanted to ask Dr. Tom Kanon to come and talk to us about the Battle of New Orleans. He's recently got a new book out, Tennesseans at War, 1812 to 1815. Dr. Kanon works at the State Library and Archives, and he's been there about 20 years. So with any further delay, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kanon. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Ken. And thank you. I'm glad to be here today on this cold afternoon. Thank you for giving up some of your time to come here. It couldn't be a better time for me as a historian of the War of 1812, because this is, as you know, the bicentennial, which is now winding down and climaxing in its probably most greatest event, and that's the Battle of New Orleans, January 8th of 1815, 200 years ago. And in fact, I'll be out at the Hermitage in a few days for some events that are occurring out there at Andrew Jackson's home. And I'm excited about that, but I'm very excited to be here with you because you're the people that potentially might read the book. And so it's important for me to go out and peddle my wares, as it were, which is a very interesting and somewhat confusing role for me, because normally I spend hours and hours alone researching, writing. I do a lot of academic presentations, but now I'm going out and actually selling soap and peddling my book and trying to generate sales for my publisher. And so what I've done, I've actually started watching that QVC network, because there's a guy on there, his name is David. This guy can sell anything. And I thought, boy, if I can just be like him, I want to buy a blender when I watch this guy. He's so good. And he's so easy, and he believes in his product. And I thought, well, gee, I can do that. I believe in my product. But nevertheless, it's still somewhat awkward to do it because you're basically selling yourself in a way. But I did put a lot of research into the book. It is a culmination of probably 15 years worth of research. I used 67 different primary sources from nearly 20 different institutions. I have about 82 published primary sources in there and over 300 secondary sources that are cited in the book. And oddly enough, to make a confession to you, it's still not the book that I really wanted to come out, truth be known. The original manuscript I sent in to the University of Alabama Press was actually twice as long as what they wanted. So I had to cut the baby in half, so to speak, which was excruciating for me. Like King Solomon, I thought, how am I going to do this? Well, I had to do it in order to get the book published, so I did. And so what I decided to do was concentrate more on the foundation, the political and military aspects of the war from the Tennessee point of view, and saved the other, which would be a follow-up book that I'm currently editing right now, which will have more of the cultural and social aspects of the war from the Tennessee point of view. But I thought it important to at least lay down the foundation and explain why Tennessee was in the War of 1812, what they were fighting for, and what the results were, and what it meant for posterity. So I divided the book into 7 chapters, which I'm just going to briefly go through. And the first chapter, what I do is set up Tennessee as a frontier state. And that's the most important thing to realize in going into the book, is that Tennessee is considered the West at this time. It's referred to as a Western province or state. It also has one other aspect that the eastern states do not have, and that's a very near and deep legacy to Indian warfare that really made its imprint on this area, even right around here, in the 1780s and 90s, as white settlers were moving into what is basically Indian hunting grounds and trying to take it over. So there was a lot of brutal warfare on both sides that occurred and left an indelible memory. And I think that's very important to remember because it leads into the so-called Creek War of 1813 and 14. Then I also talk about the importance of the river systems in this chapter. They had goods that they needed to get to a market, and the rivers was the best source to do that. I also talk about society in general at that time, and then go into a discussion about the causes of the War of 1812, because one of the things that I find interesting in talking to groups is that they really don't understand what the war is all about. They know, for instance, that we fought it against Great Britain, but they're not quite sure why. So what I always do when I speak to a group such as yourself, I always start off with a question. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when someone says the War of 1812? And invariably, I get two answers. I get either Andrew Jackson or the Battle of New Orleans. Fort McHenry, Star-Spangled Banner, correct. That's the other thing that the war is noted for. It gave us a very inspiring, patriotic, but sometimes difficult to sing national anthem, which really wasn't our national anthem until the 1930s. But nevertheless, its roots, exactly right, sir, the War of 1812, Fort McHenry. That is the third answer that I usually get. And in the first chapter, I discuss society at large, and I talk about the fact that it's a very violent society. The courts of those days were just filled with records of people engaged in physical fighting or suing each other for whatever reason. And of course, you've all heard about the duels that occur between the upper class, if you will. Andrew Jackson being one notable duelist. And it occurred to me that the war, in a way, with Great Britain was sort of like a duel. And I want to read from the first chapter about honor. A nation going to war over issues of honor should never be underestimated. In his 1812 public address to the Tennessee militia, Colonel James Henderson prodded their sense of pride by insisting he would not tolerate any cowards among them. Quote, "What is life to that man who forfeits his honor?" he asked. "He lives a disgrace to himself and dishonor to his children." Now, interestingly, Henderson was later killed in the Battle of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson proclaimed death before dishonor as his personal motto. If honor was the key to one's existence, then it stood to reason that a nation's honor was central to its survival. Duels solved personal disputes regarding honor in the early republic, while nations resorted to wars. Clergyman Noah Worcester's 1815 pamphlet, A Solemn Review of the Custom of War, made this telling statement, quote, "Public wars and private duels seem to be practiced on similar principles." With the honor of the nation at stake, the War of 1812 could be compared to a gentlemanly duel where insult followed insult until there was no recourse left, without losing face except that of war. For many Americans, Great Britain had cast too many affronts without having been properly rebuked. It was simply a matter of honor. Interestingly, the British also felt the same way. They felt that this war was a duel, but not between gentlemen. They said this was more like a duel between a gentleman and a chimney sweeper, which is how they depicted the Americans. Something the Americans were not fond of being called, I can assure you. And then we go into the next chapter where I talk about the volunteer spirit of Tennessee. As you may or may not know, in my opinion and other historians' opinions, the fact that we're called the volunteer state directly stems from the War of 1812. That's because when the call came out, the Tennesseans responded en masse, and there was more than enough men to fill the ranks when it came to the call. I also explain how the militia system works and what's the difference between a volunteer and a militia and a U.S. regular. It can be very confusing, especially for genealogists who say, well, I can't find my ancestor in the Tennessee militia. Well, that's because he may be in the U.S. Army. And then we go into the actual first campaigns of the war for the Tennesseans, the so-called Natchez campaign, and the East Florida campaign, which the East Tennesseans took on. And really, though, the thrust of the war is centered on Canada, because that's the British province that England is afraid of losing, and that's the way that the United States figures they can get at Great Britain. With such a navy that Great Britain has, we can't really defeat them on the seas, but we have this mass army of militiamen. We can go up into Canada, take that province, maybe even attach it to the United States, was the thought. Ironically, it worked just the opposite. Some of our best victories came on the seas, on one-on-one engagements with the British Navy, and we lost miserably on land when we tried to invade Canada several times. There were some Tennesseans involved in the Canadian front, but not very many. For the most part, in these early days, they were in these expeditions that were going down into Natchez and Mobile to try to protect that territory. And they went by boat down the Mississippi River on these huge barges that contained all these companies of men. And they were accompanied at one time by a minister, Gideon Blackburn. And he had an interesting incident on the voyage down there. Reverend Blackburn was preaching on the roof of Captain Williamson's boat when the roof caved in, causing the minister and a dozen others to fall through in mid-sermon, to the great astonishment of the preacher and others. A shaken but still inspired Blackburn finished preaching aboard Captain Isaiah Renshaw's boat, which was lashed to Williamson's unlucky vessel. Blackman conducted future prayer services in a canoe where he stood in the center with a soldier on each side of him while a steersman kept the boat steady. So Blackman was determined that he was going to preach to the men, but he had to have a soldier on each side of him to hold him steady in the canoe after that incident. I included that just for a little levity because, let's face it, war is not the most amusing subject that there is. In fact, to me, war is the greatest drama, human drama that exists. We're talking about life and death here. And these men appreciated any sort of levity that happened. And certainly I'm sure that created a big uproar when they saw the minister fall through the roof of this boat. Then in the next chapter, I go on to explain what the Creek War is all about. Now, some people say, why is the Creek War enmeshed or attached to the War of 1812? And I make the comment in the book that for most Tennesseans that fought in the War of 1812, the Creek War was the War of 1812, because that's where most of the men fought. It's a very complicated situation why we're fighting the Creeks. But suffice it to say that as anywhere in the frontier, we're encroaching on Indian land, they're pushing back, they're getting aid, supposedly, from Britain, which is assumed by all Americans at that time. Whenever an Indian depredation occurs, it's always assumed that the British are behind it. It's fascinating to read the newspapers of that day because they make this assumption constantly. Even down here in Alabama, where the Creek Indians are, every time there's a depredation, boom, it must be the British that are stirring up these Indians. And one such incident occurs in May of 1811 when the kidnapping of a white woman named Martha Crawley along the Duck River. And it creates a huge furor throughout the state because her family is killed, children are massacred, and she is taken prisoner by the Creek Indians and taken down into the Creek Nation. Well, this really stirs up the Tennesseans, and it provides them, in a way, with an excuse to go down there and chastise the Creeks, something that they've wanted to do for a long time. And the reason why they wanted to do that is not just from personal revenge, but Alabama has a lot of good river systems, you see, that go into the Gulf of Mexico. And we go back to chapter 1 where I talked about the river systems and surplus of goods. That's where it ties in, because the creeks represented land that the whites wanted. And the best way to do that would be to defeat them in war and take that land as payment for the war, which is exactly what happened. And that excuse didn't come with Martha Crawley. It almost did, but it finally broke. The string finally broke in August of 1813 at a place called Fort Mims outside of Mobile, where 250 white settlers were massacred by the Creek Indians. This was the final straw, because now it was up to the Tennesseans and the other states of the old Southwest to go and chastise the Creeks once and for all. The interesting thing is, however, Jackson, of course, is the main character here because he's Major General of the Tennessee militia. He's one of the major generals. The other major general is a person named John Cock in East Tennessee, and they don't like each other. In fact, East Tennesseans don't like West Tennesseans. Keep in mind that this area here, Middle Tennessee, was called West Tennessee at that time. So whenever you hear West Tennessee referred to in this time period, they're talking about this section of the state. And the two sections didn't really like each other. The state capital had just moved from Knoxville to Nashville in 1812, and that created a political setback for the Easterners. So they were not fond of each other, and I get this sense every time I'm reading documents from this period about the Army, I see this friction that's going on between the two. In fact, John Cock in East Tennessee doesn't even want to give Jackson supplies or men, because he's telling his men, why should we give them? Let's get our own glories in the field, as he refers to it. And so they attacked this branch of the Creeks called the Hillabys in November of 1813, and they massacred them. And that might have been all well and good for Jackson, except for one thing. The Hillabys had promised to surrender to Jackson just a day or two before they were massacred by the East Tennesseans. And time travel being what it was in communication, the East Tennesseans were not aware of this. So needless to say, the Hillabys were slightly upset by this and became fierce enemies of the Americans after that incident. But the early battles of the Creek War were pretty much unevenly, the Creeks were outmatched terribly, 3-1 in most cases, didn't have very many weapons, and it was pretty much of a massacre. And a lot of these accounts are left by the Tennesseans. In fact, one of the most famous Tennesseans, David Crockett, was in the Creek War. And he left in his autobiography a fascinating account of one of the engagements of the Creek War at Tallahatchie. In fact, he did such a good job that he knocked the screen off. Well, we won't worry about that. And for you out there in the viewing audience, don't worry about it. We'll just go on, okay? At Tallahatchie, it was an Indian village, Creek Indian village. The Creeks were trapped there. They were surrounded. As the Creek warriors retreated to their village, one Red Stick leader climbed on the roof of a structure and exhorted the Creeks to stand and fight, insisting spirits would deflect the bullets fired by the whites. The advancing Tennesseans quickly shot him down. Once inside the confines of the village, Coffey's men raced from hut to hut, killing every Creek warrior they could find. In the frenzy of the action, some women and children became victims of their rage. David Crockett, one of the attackers, recalled seeing a large number of Creeks running into a house where a squaw sat in the doorway with her feet against a bow. The woman took an arrow, raised her feet, and drew back with all her might, letting the arrow fly toward the oncoming Tennesseans. The arrow struck and killed one of the soldiers, the first man Crockett had ever seen, slain by a bow and arrow. So enraged were the Tennesseans that they fired on the woman until at least 20 rifle balls blew through her. We now shot them like dogs, Crockett recalled, as they set the house on fire with over 40 persons in it. These are the type of descriptions that I was referring to earlier when we were talking about Indian warfare, the brutality of it. And this account is very typical of the style of fighting that is going on during the Creek War. But once the Creek War is finally over, and by the way, it doesn't end until approximately early 1814, the climactic Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March 27th, 1814, in which 900 Creek warriors were slaughtered in one day, which is the greatest defeat of Native Americans in North American history. And Jackson, of course, was the head of the army at that time. The Creeks surrender. They have a treaty at a place called Fort Jackson, and they give up 23 million acres of Creek territory. So the Tennesseans, in effect, get what they wanted from the Creek War. They got the lands that the Creeks had. With the Creek War over, Jackson moves on down into Florida, which is owned by Spain. To give you an international aspect of the War of 1812, it's not just Britain and the United States. Spain is neutral. But they own Florida, and guess what? We also want Florida too, because that's preventing the access to the Gulf. So it would be really nice if we can get Florida. And besides, those Spanish are always stirring up the Indians too, according to the Tennesseans. If they're not blaming the British for it, they're blaming the Spanish. And the Spanish are allowing the British to come into Florida. Now around this time, we're talking late 1814, and the British decide, well, we need to have a diversion from our Canadian campaign. So we need to have a southern front. And if we can, we're going to capture the city of New Orleans, which is the prize jewel of the West, because that is the main terminus for all those surplus goods that are coming from the frontier. So they set up shop in Pensacola, Florida, which is owned by Spain. Jackson doesn't like this. He sends communications to the Spanish governor saying, don't do this. I'm going to come pay you a visit if you should continue this. And he does. Now, he's really breaking international law when he does this because the Spanish are neutral in this war. So he writes to the government in Washington saying what he's going to do, letting them know ahead of time that he's going to create a potential international incident. So the government writes back and says, well, we prefer you not do this, but if you do it, make sure that you do it on the grounds that you have some basis for it, that they're inciting the Indians and that they're protecting the British. So they sort of give him a wink and they turn their heads knowing that Jackson's going to do it anyway, which he does. And in early November of 1814, he takes over the town of Pensacola from the Spanish, kicks the British out, and then that leaves one more destination for the British, New Orleans. So now we come to December 1814. The British start to advance on the city of New Orleans. Very interesting place at that time, still is. New Orleans, for all intents and purposes, is really a foreign domain, if you will. Louisiana had just become a state in 1812. The population there, most of them speak French. They're not very fond of Americans who are coming in on a daily basis, taking over their government, their politics, their way of life. In fact, there's hardly any newspapers that are even in English. The courts speak French, so that when a lawyer is giving a presentation in the court, some of the juror members have to have it interpreted for them. And when I looked on a map one time, it occurred to me, a map of that era, it occurred to me that Louisiana is the very first state to become a state that was not physically attached to the United States, or to another state rather. If you look on the map, there is territories that were around it, what they call the Mississippi Territory. So it was the first state that was admitted that wasn't bordering another state in the Union. So distance even made it seem like a foreign place. As I said, they weren't particularly fond of Americans, and they didn't know what to make of Jackson. They considered him just somebody who massacred Indians. He didn't fight fair. He wasn't civilized. But they were afraid of the British. So at this point, anybody would be great to have to help them. So Jackson enters the city, builds up the fortifications, assembles an army that by today's standards would be called a motley group. He not only has the Tennesseans, he has the Kentuckians, he has Louisiana Militia Volunteers, Mississippi Territory Volunteers, U.S. Regular Army. He has some Choctaw Indians with him. And last but not least, he enlists the aids of Jean Lafitte and his Baratarian pirates who were in the area. Jean Lafitte, by the way, hated the term pirate. He felt insulted that he should be called a pirate. He preferred the word privateer. So he and his men, the privateers, did have something that Jackson needed beside men, and that was materiel. They had some gunpowder, some flints, some firearms. So Jackson made a deal with these bandits saying, we'll absolve you of all your sins if you join our ranks and give us what you have, which they did. And so they cut a deal. And they fought with Jackson at New Orleans. In fact, some of the Baratarians were on the front lines at the Battle of New Orleans manning the artillery and did a very good job of it. So now the British arrive at New Orleans, and they don't know how many Americans there are. The Americans don't know how many British there are. One of the fascinating things about the battle itself, or the campaign rather, is that neither side knew the strength of the other side. Each side always exaggerated the strength of the other, and I sometimes think they did that on purpose to make themselves look better. Oh, we had to face 20,000 British troops, and we beat them. And the British were saying, well, we had to take on 20,000 American troops, no wonder we lost. The fact of the matter is, although there is a lot of dispute about how many troops were on each side, it can be roughly assumed that they were about even, about 7,000 on each side. But the difference is that the Americans are entrenched behind a fortification, humble as it may be, called Line Jackson. And if you go down to the Chalmette field today, which, by the way, the park is called the Jean Lafitte National Park. It's not called Chalmette, it's called Jean Lafitte. If you go down there today, you can see remnants of those ramparts. This was going to become the most famous rampart or fortification probably in North American history, at least for that time period. Because on January 8th, that's where you had the climactic battle of New Orleans, in which a handful of casualties on the American side, 13 to be exact, were killed, versus hundreds of British and thousands wounded on the British side. And there's a lot of discussion about why that happened, how that happened. I cover it in great detail in the book. In fact, I devote at least 2 chapters to the battle, or the campaigns rather, because it was such a monumentous victory for the Americans. And as you know, it actually came after the treaty was signed in a Belgian town called Ghent. On December 24th of 1814, the delegates from Britain and England signed a peace treaty. Problem is, though, is that it wouldn't go into effect until it was ratified by each country. It had been ratified by England, but not the United States, and would not be until February of 1815. So those who say that the battle was fought for nothing, it's not quite accurate, because for all intents and purposes, both nations were still at war. There are so many incidents involved with the war that it was very difficult for me to write these chapters, because I had to sift through all the anecdotes that were handed down from generation to generation. So unless I could find evidence for it, I didn't put it in there. And there were some great anecdotes, believe me, that came down from the battle. But at one time, I was in Middle Tennessee State University, where was a graduate student, and I came across a collection of papers, the King family papers, and it was unprocessed at the time. And it said King family papers 1812 to 19-something. So that intrigued me, the fact that there was something in this collection that went back to 1812. So I thought I would investigate. This was many years ago. And so I went to their special collections and I said, I'd like to look at that unprocessed collection, the King family. And the very first box I opened up, in the very first folder, there was a letter from a man named James King, who was at the Battle of New Orleans. And he talked about an engagement that occurred on December 23rd, this so-called famous night battle. It was the first encounter between the Americans and British. They fought it at night. There was a lot of friendly fire going on. Men were walking into each other's lines and being captured. It was a very important battle because it established who was going to be where on the battlefield. And had the British pursued it, they might have been able to take the city that night, but they didn't. Anyway, he recounted a tale of one of the men that he knew, which was fascinating because I'd never encountered it before. No one had ever done it, and I think hopefully I was the first one that did. And I included it in the book. It was about a officer named Daniel Treadwell. And I write that a junior officer named Daniel Treadwell had the most adventurous encounter of the night. As he was being led away by a lone, he was captured. As he was being led away by a lone British guard, Treadwell turned and made a remark about the British being in retreat. When the guard turned to look, Treadwell took out a pistol he had hidden under his coat and shot the tricked British soldier. Treadwell then took the guard's gun and ran toward what he hoped were the American lines. Instead, he ran headlong into the British, who recaptured him. As he was being escorted away again, this time by 2 sentries, intense firing broke out close by, and as the guards turned toward the direction of the fire, Treadwell seized the moment to knock one of them down and make yet another hairbreadth escape. Treadwell's luck finally ran out when he came across a mortally wounded American officer who begged Treadwell to stay with him. Treadwell complied, and through this act of kindness was taken prisoner for a third and final time by the British. And that's just one of those anecdotes that I was so pleased to find, because it had been hidden away in this box for 200 years nearly. And it was just one of those gems, as you know, if you do research, that you're privy to, that come every once in a blue moon, that you just relish with joy when you find it. So Jackson wins the battle, becomes a hero, but he's got some other problems in New Orleans. In fact, Jackson's put on trial in New Orleans, and he has to pay a $1,000 fine, and I explain that in the book. Apparently, after the battle campaign was over, he did not lift martial law, which he imposed on the city. The population was getting nervous, and the British are gone. We've beaten them. Why don't you lift martial law? Jackson said, well, I'm not sure that they're gone. They may come back. So he doesn't lift it. And besides, the rumors that the war is over, I haven't been confirmed. I don't have a confirmation from Washington that this happened. And until I do, martial law stays. Well, that didn't sit well with the citizens. They made some disparaging remarks about him in the newspapers. Next thing you know, Jackson's starting to arrest people, including a Superior Court judge, throws them in jail. In fact, he banishes them from New Orleans, tells them to get up to Natchez until everything is over with. Well, the word finally comes that the war is over. Jackson lifts martial law, but the judge is going to have his revenge, so he more or less puts Jackson on trial for contempt of court. And Jackson has to pay this $1,000 fine. So he kind of leaves the city with a little bit of a dual legacy. In one hand, he was a hero, but for some people, he was what Jackson is to some people, this villainous person. But it's soon forgotten, because in the victory, as you know, victories erase all kinds of wrongs. So he comes home a hero to Tennessee. It leads him to a career, political career eventually. It leads him to the White House, changes the course of history. But for the other men that were in the Battle of New Orleans, the war didn't end so well, because after the campaign, sickness was rampant through camp. And very many of the soldiers that had survived the campaign actually died in camp from disease. Hundreds of them did. Dysentery, smallpox, measles, even diarrhea. was fatal in those days. The ones that did survive, however, trudged their way back up the Natchez Trace. That's how most of these men came home from New Orleans. They walked or rode all the way. And one of the men who was down there was a young man named Andrew Jackson Edmonston, which I always thought was interesting that his name was Andrew Jackson, even though he was born in the early 1790s, because Jackson must have had some influence even before he became famous in the region. So Andrew Jackson Edmonston has one advantage. He has a horse. And he's going to trot back up the Natchez Trace. However, he runs into an old school friend of his, okay? A young man named Samuel Hope. And Samuel Hope is dying on the trace. And he begs Edmonston not to leave him there, because if you leave me here, I know I will die. Please take me home with you. So Edmonston puts him on his horse and walks alongside the horse all the way back up the trace. And in his memoir, Edmonston's memoir, he left what I thought to me was one of the most moving entries that I had read about the war and the men returning home. Lieutenant Edmonston, still trudging beside his slow-moving horse carrying the sickly Samuel Hope, approached his family's residence near Nashville unannounced early one morning. Edmonston eagerly climbed the fence and observed some of his family walking in the yard. No one noticed him until he fired his pistol in the air. His sisters and parents ran to him, rejoicing over his safe return. None but them that have gone through just such a scrape as we had can tell how we all felt, Edmonston later recorded. For myself, I was fully paid for all my trials. My dear old mother hung on my neck. I was her youngest. And I thought that could be true of any return home from any war. Here was a man who had been through all the battles, as a matter of fact, through the Creek War even. He had survived it all, and his reward was just to get a hug from his mother. That was the best thing that happened to him. One other thing happened to him, too. He became a man, literally, because he joins the Army when he's about 18. He goes through all the scrapes and comes out of the war. He's about 21 now, and he comes home a lieutenant. And he says in his memoir that for the first time he felt that his father respected him because he had survived the war and come home a man. He said, my father used to look at me as a mama's boy before that. He said, and I was. He said, but when I came home from the war, he said, I could see the respect in his eye. And coincidentally, that is the sort of respect that Tennessee gets after the war, because this frontier state that's out in the middle of nowhere now has some notoriety, and it becomes escalated in status throughout the country. And the Tennessee Volunteers become a national name. And we literally get put on the map because of the War of 1812. And hopefully it's been that way since. So I'm going to stop the lecture part of it, because the part of any talk that I enjoy the most is to get questions from you, because I want to know what you want to know. And if I can't give you the answer, I'll make one up. So I'm just going to open it up for your questions. Sir.
Would you expound some on the first trip that Andrew Jackson and his militia took down the Natchez Trace and were ordered to come back?
Yes.
And second, his experience that he also gave up his horse for a wounded man.
That is an anecdote that I've come across, yes. And I've never been able to verify it with a primary source. So I did not include it in the book. That's one of those anecdotal things that I would love to put in, but I just simply couldn't find a basis in fact for it. And it probably did happen, I'm not sure. But as I said before, unless I could find it verified in some sort of original official document or letter of correspondence of the time period, I was a little bit reluctant to put it in. But to answer the first part of your question, the so-called Natchez expedition, December 1812, thousands of volunteers gather right here in Nashville to answer a call that the government had to go down. They're anticipating some action down in the Mobile region, perhaps even New Orleans. They need some protection. So Jackson is the head of this army. As I said before, they take this flotilla down the Mississippi River, down to the city of Natchez, where they await instructions from the government. What do we do next? So they're there for a good month or so, and finally they get the letter from the government saying, well, we really don't need you, and you don't have to go down to Mobile or New Orleans. In fact, just turn your men home. Well, that's the last thing Jackson wanted to hear, trust me. And so he's incensed. He fires off a series of letters to the congressmen, to everybody he can think of, saying, how could you do this? My men are here, da, da. And he takes it upon himself to make sure that they get home okay, even using some of his funds. And that's where the incident of the horse comes in. And also there was the incident of supposedly he acquiring the name of Old Hickory based on that expedition. Again, another anecdote that I could not verify for sure. I footnoted in the book, but I cannot honestly say how Andrew Jackson acquired that name. There are 2-3 different stories about how he acquired the nickname Old Hickory. But I can tell you this for sure. I did see him referred to as Old Hickory in an 1815 newspaper. So certainly by the end of the war, the public knows him as Old Hickory. So he was given the name sometime during the war. I'm just not sure how. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned the Creek War.
Mm-hmm.
When did it end?
Mm-hmm.
When did it end?
Well, for all intents and purposes, the fighting ended in March of 1814 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March 27th. But the actual treaty, the formal treaty, was not signed until August 9 of 1814. The treaty was a little bit on the uneven side, shall we say, because most of the Creek chiefs that signed it were actually friendly to the United States. There was only 2, I believe, Creek chiefs, and they were, the warring faction of the Creeks, by the way, were the Red Sticks. So if you ever see that phrase, the Red Sticks. There were only 2 Red Stick chiefs that had actually signed the Treaty of Fort Jackson. The rest of the chiefs of the 30-some that signed were actually allied to the United States at the time.
And when did it begin?
We declared, Tennessee that is, declared war in late September of 1813. So that's when we gave an official declaration of war. I cannot remember the exact date. It might be September 23rd, I think, or 22nd. But the actual declaration of war was done by the General Assembly right here in Nashville. And they had to be, that's an interesting, I'm glad you brought that up because it's an interesting point that I bring up in the book and discuss at length, because they're not supposed to do that. A state cannot declare war on an Indian nation at that time. Only the federal government can do that. So how did Tennessee get away with it? Very simply. The way they word the document, they're saying, we're going to defend our borders, our frontiers from the Creek Indians. Of course, their method of defense is to go down into the Creek Nation and have an offensive maneuver against the Creeks. But they cleverly word it as a defensive maneuver rather than an offensive maneuver because they want the federal government to fund this expedition. Wars cost money, you know. And that was one thing that the legislature was concerned with. Who's going to pay for all these soldiers? So they petitioned the government to do it. And they, with a sigh of relief, they get back an answer from the government saying, yes, we will fund this expedition into the Creek Nation, because otherwise they were going to have to fund them themselves and probably go into debt doing it. Ken?
2 questions. So the people in New Orleans didn't really see Jackson as any kind of savior. They were, I mean, how did they react to his presence and the American presence?
Of course, Jackson kind of made friends and enemies wherever he went. That was the one thing about Andrew Jackson. people ask me how I feel about him personally, having researched him, and I said, well, I would say he was sort of guy that you would want on your side, that's for sure, and not on your side. There was a certain faction, political faction, that did not like Jackson. They didn't trust him. He was too crude for them. But the general population embraced him for one simple reason: he saved their city. And even before the climactic battles at New Orleans, they saw what he was doing, how he was fortifying the city. He was bringing these troops together. That was, to me, that was his masterful touch of the whole campaign, was not the actual fighting, because the British really blundered their way into losing that battle. But Jackson, to his credit, pulled off a great defensive maneuver, but he also was great in gathering these disparate groups of people together, this Creole population, the French population, the American population. He brings them all together, unified. Of course, it's easier to do that when there's an enemy at the door. And he saves the city, he becomes a savior, literally a savior. He's even given a crown, a wreath, laurel. And there's a celebration at the St. Louis Cathedral, which is standing in what is now called Jackson Square. And in fact, there's going to be a ceremony there in a few days, laying of the wreath, at Jackson equestrian statue, which is the same one that is over here by the Capitol. And Jackson is given a crown. He's actually considered a savior. And there's a big formal ceremony in which he's embraced by the population, and they go nuts over him. But that soon loses favor when he doesn't lift the ban of martial law in the town, because these people would like to come and go as they please. And martial law prohibits you to do that. So as I said, he kind of left New Orleans with a dual legacy. Yes, anything else? Sir?
Once after the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend, and everything, whatever amount of the Creek people that were left, what happened to them? What really took place? Did they assimilate to whatever was left as far as the new population moving in, or did they go off somewhere?
The whole basis of the Creek War and of all the southwestern, what we called the Old Southwest in those days, the basis for all that territory was Indian removal. You see it constantly in the dictates of the Tennessee government. Indian removal, not just the Creeks. We're talking about the Cherokee, Chickasaw. We all want to remove them to the west of the Mississippi. That's the plan. It doesn't finally occur until the 1830s. In the meantime, are these Indians going to assimilate into white culture? Some do. Cherokee, as you know, assimilated very well into white culture, having large established farms, slaves. But it always seemed to me that they were still Indians and that they were competition for the Euro-Americans. So the Creeks were still there. Some of them assimilated into white culture, but they were never quite happy. And all through that period until final removal, there are depredations that occur throughout that time period from time to time. Little incidents, a murder here and there, horse stealing, that kind of thing. They're very disgruntled, and there's all this unease that is going on throughout that territory. Curiously enough, once the land is open in Alabama, who do you think comes down and settles it but a lot of the soldiers that fought in the Creek War? I've traced some of these men, and a lot of them actually came back to what is now Alabama to live. Once the lands were opened up, Alabama becomes a state in 1819. And some of the first settlers there were the very soldiers that fought to get that land in the first place. Sir, you had another question?
What was your sense in your research of Jackson's motivation? I've read several books about it. It seemed to me like one of the things he wanted to do is expand the elite of the plantation system, for one thing. And then another thing would be he was afraid of all the British and the French and the Spanish having access to our territory.
Yes, Yes, one of the other offshoots of this theory of Indian removal is to not only get their lands, but to remove the threat of foreign intrigue. In other words, we're not going to have the British or Spanish stir up these Indians anymore. So if we take over that land, it's going to eliminate that threat of foreign intrigue. So that I buy into. Now the other one, in terms of elite plantation promoting slavery, I'm not as fond of that theory as the first one, for one simple reason, because I think too much emphasis, and this is just my opinion, too much emphasis is placed on the slavery issue of that day, okay? And in other words, to promote it throughout. Because it seemed to me that was a given. They're going to do that. That's obvious that they're going to do that. Once we get the land, we're just going to take it over. And it's obvious that we're going to bring our plantations and our slaves with that. It really becomes an issue later on into the 1820s and 30s, where you do get into when the West becomes the South. And I always think that's a fascinating subject, because when does Tennessee become a frontier state, a southern state from a frontier state? That's when that issue really comes to the forefront. But in the time period of Jackson, I don't really think he's sitting down and consciously thinking, we better take over the lands in Alabama so we can promote slavery and extend it. I just don't think he's thinking that. I do think he's thinking that that land should be taken over by whites to eliminate Indian threat and to eliminate foreign intrigue. That's my take on it. Yes, sir.
One thing that I'm kind of indistinct about is the boundary of the Florida territory and what exactly was under Spanish control. And the second question related to that, who had sovereignty over Mobile prior to the Fort Mims massacre?
Florida was divided into two provinces owned by Spain, East Florida and West Florida. Basically, the boundaries are very similar to what they are now, except West Florida, which would have been the panhandle part, extended closer over to Louisiana than it now does. I can't give you the exact latitude of it, but it did include Mobile, certainly. And we took Mobile in 1813, and we didn't give it back after the war. And curiously enough, it's the only territory that America gained from the War of 1812. We didn't gain Canada, because we never conquered it. We gained Indian land, yes. But in terms of foreign land, that's the only foreign land that we actually got, was the city of Mobile. We didn't give it back. And the British were going to take it back for the Spanish. There's a fort called Fort Bowyer down there. They tried to attack it twice. Once they did attack it after the Battle of New Orleans. They took the fort in February of 1815, after the Battle of New Orleans. And which would have been very interesting, because with that fort they could have taken Mobile back and maybe launched another campaign against New Orleans. But by that time the news of the treaty had finally come. In fact, right at that moment, as they're taking the fort, the news comes from across the sea. The war's over. So they pull back. But it would have been an interesting dynamic had they pursued that. In fact, I make it the point in the book, it would have been interesting to see in the Battle of New Orleans, what if the Battle of New Orleans had been fought earlier in the war? What if it had been fought in 1813, say, instead of 1815? Would it have had the impact that it did? The fact that it came at the very end of the war, I think, is pivotal to its legacy, because it gave the illusion, if you will, that we won the war, because we defeated the British so badly at that battle, and peace came right after it, that for many Americans, we defeated the British and won the war. When if you look at the stipulations of the Treaty of Ghent, it's a status ante quo bellum. In other words, things go back to the way they were before the war started. So nothing was gained or lost based on that treaty. But the Floridas were always a sore spot for the Americans. They wanted the Floridas. The Spanish were weak. They had a tenuous hold on the Floridas. And we finally went down in 1817 and 18 with the First Seminole War, led by Andrew Jackson, to take care of the Seminole Indians who were acting up the same way the Creeks were acting up, thinking, well, we'll beat the Seminoles, we'll take this land too. They finally get the land from Spain in the Gadsden Purchase of 1819, and who gets appointed territorial governor of Florida? Andrew Jackson. So he's back in Pensacola after that. Doesn't like it down there though. He's only down there a year or so. So Florida is a very, very interesting aspect of the war, and very difficult to explain. But it is, to me, that international aspect of the war that's fascinating, because it's just not cut and dry. Britain versus American Indians are thrown in the mix. There's all these international nations. France is involved at some point. It gets very interesting, and it's all about Florida. When Jefferson bought the Louisiana Purchase, they thought that Florida should have been thrown in. They thought part of Florida was part of the Louisiana Purchase. That was part of the dispute with Florida. That's why we took Mobile, because we were convinced that that was part of the Louisiana Purchase. And many Americans said, forget about Louisiana Purchase, we don't even want it. What we do want is Florida. And many congressmen at that time said, we could forsake the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, just let us have Florida. That's how important it was to Americans at that time. Anything else? Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I appreciate it. And oh, the book is on sale here. It's $39. If you would like to buy a copy, I'm here. I would be happy to sign it for you. And if not, you can get it on Amazon. It'll be a little bit more on Amazon. But you can get it through that as well. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate everybody being here. I want to thank Dr. Kanon for coming and talking about the Battle of New Orleans. The 200th anniversary is Sunday. So, and again, I appreciate you coming. The first Tuesday in February will be Betsy Thorpe talking about the train wreck at Dutchman's Curve. It's still the worst train wreck in American history, still. So, in 1918. So, please come for that. I appreciate you being here today. Tom will be up here to sign his books, and y'all have a great day. Take care.